morning, everybody. It's a small crowd, which is perfectly fine because when I told Gary we would be doing this, I was like, don't worry, Gary. It's going to be super small. It'll be intimate. We can have a fireside chat.
Where's the fire?
And now I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't even see the audience. So why are we here? To talk about governance. And why am I starting? Because Gary, who may not remember this, but several years ago, when I was at the very first Quantum World Congress, in fact, I don't even know if you were there, Gary, but I ran into someone named Sean Dudley, who is with the, what's his title? He's
Coordinator, director, I don't know.
Of the Arizona Regions, which is kind of the institution that governs all of the Arizona universities. And he and I got to talking about how I have a fear of over-regulating quantum. Now, if you happen to catch my earlier talk, I talked a lot about export control, and that's where my primary focus had been, which is, oh my gosh, these systems are so nascent, let's not control them. In fact, I had volunteered to be the chair of the law TAC for QEDC and spent a lot of my time talking about that there. And what I found is, with all due respect to my government brethren, I used to be a federal attorney myself, they have a healthy skepticism of industry coming in and saying, please don't regulate us. I think we have a number of examples as to why that skepticism may be warranted in part. However, we also have a number of examples of where it's not and where overregulation can really crush an innovation and the growing industry. And I was lamenting to Sean about this, and he said, well, Kaniah, we have a professor who focuses on this, who writes about growing tech, and you know, you've got to meet him. And I was so honored to have the chance to work with Gary and to get his perspective and to hear some of the stories that he's focused on in his, you know, in his research. And even more important, to have somebody who's not in industry who can also talk to and talk through the potential of governance. And so at the time when I first met Gary, I was so excited, and we started doing some work around this. And then, well, it's probably even before then, I suppose, as over the course of this time of meeting Gary, we have had ChatGPT and AI grow. And I think, you know, what I would like to kind of position today is when you think about AI and you see everybody coming up with some framework, because we've got to regulate it, right? It's really scary. And some of it is based in knowledge, and some of it is based in just complete conjecture without actually understanding the frameworks. I feel like now is really, really right to start talking about quantum. And in fact, if you all happen to visit or go to one of the sessions on Monday that talked about quantum and ethics, this topic came up. And I heard several people say, you know what? We already have a bunch of these frameworks happening in AI. Let's just take that and slap it on quantum. And for those of you in the industry, I hope you're afraid of that, because that doesn't work. It doesn't work. The risks in AI and the issues that come up in AI are just not the same as what we find in quantum. And I am not dismissing. There are huge risks with quantum when the systems mature and when we see whether there's, you know, their applicability in cryptography and certain other areas. There's a number of different potentials, and we do need to have a governance structure. But we also need to be careful. So with that, I have the pleasure of also introducing Gary Marchant. Gary, you want to talk a little bit about your career and
Sure.
what you've done?
Thanks, Kaniah. It's great to talk with you about this. So I've been working on governing a variety of emerging technologies for the last 25 years. I direct the center at ASU on that, the Center for Law, Science, Innovation. And we've been looking at a series of technologies over this time period. And now quantum's sort of the next big thing. And so I'm interested in quantum, not a quantum expert, but I've been able to learn from Kaniah and others a little bit about it. And so I'm really interested in sort of how some of the lessons we've learned from other technologies can apply to quantum. So one of the key threshold issues is, when is regulation appropriate? There's a famous book written by a guy named David Coleridge called The Coleridge Dilemma, saying if you regulate too soon, you're not going to know what the real issues are. You're going to regulate phantom risks, hypothetical risks that don't ever turn out to be real. If you wait too long, it's too late to really affect the direction and the scope of the industry and what kind of safeguards they put in place. It's sort of all already locked in. And so it's this dilemma of you want to be not too early, not too late. So one of the questions is, where are we with quantum? Are we ready to start regulating, or is it too early? Personally, I think it is too early. I think you want to have real identifiable risks before you regulate those risks. But the question is, when do you see those? And there's this sort of new movement, mostly coming from Europe, but also in the United States, of responsible research and innovation, of anticipatory governance, to anticipate what these risks will be and try to prevent them from ever occurring, which is again sort of pushing the timeline earlier. And certainly there are examples where that could have been done. You can look at something like, say, facial recognition. Of a lot of these companies train their facial recognition only on white males. And sure enough, you put these systems in the field and they have horrible accuracy rates for women and men of color. And people go to jail improperly because of that. That should have been anticipated and prevented. And it could easily be prevented by having more representative data sets to train the system on. So there are definite risks that you can anticipate and prevent. And so this idea of responsible innovation or anticipatory risk assessment or anticipatory governance is a good one. It's one the OECD has several reports on, and it's something people in the quantum industry should be thinking about. When is it appropriate to start anticipating what those risks are, and are there things that can be done now? But going too early does have its risks too. It can really squash innovation. It can pose a lot of costs and burdens on an early industry and really squash out a lot of the innovation and creativity. So that's the first threshold of the question, I think, is when is government ready, regulation necessary, governance necessary. It's good to be thinking ahead, it's good to be anticipatory, but at least from my perspective, a pretty primitive understanding of quantum, I don't see those big risks there yet.
Yeah, I feel like I have a fairly good understanding of quantum after 7 years working in Honeywell Quantum Solutions, now Quantinuum. I agree, I don't think we're ready yet. And in talking to Gary, one of the things that we started talking about is looking at other industries and when regulations have come in and when it's been positive and negative. And one of the first stories I remember you telling was in the biotech industry. And I was just absolutely fascinated with what happened. Do you mind kind of sharing a little bit about that history?
Sure. So in the 1980s, as genetic engineering was going from the laboratory to actual products being field tested out in the world and commercially grown, there was growing concern about these mutant strains that could possibly get out and escape, and fears about this. And so there started to be uneasiness. There was movies like the Andromeda Strain, if you recall that, scared a lot of people. There were bills being introduced in Congress to create new agencies and new statutes to regulate biotechnology. There were states starting to adopt state laws now that we're seeing that happening with AI too. And in response to that, Congress, the public, state legislatures, the biotech industry went to the federal government and say, regulate us, put these regulations in place. And in 1986, the Office of Science and Technology Policy put forward the coordinated framework for the regulation of biotechnology that's been there ever since. And it's been somewhat successful. Biotechnology has thrived in the United States, but it's also been a failure in other ways. One of the things it's done is it's basically squished out all the academic and small and medium-sized businesses. So the only companies that can afford to get through the regulatory labyrinth that's now been put in place are huge multinationals developing huge commodity crops. Those are the only ones that make sense to spend the over $100 million it costs to develop the regulatory costs for a genetically modified product. Any other agricultural product produced by any other method is zero regulatory costs. There is no pre-market regulation. But if you use genetic engineering, it's over $100 million and an extra 10 years of regulatory burdens you have to go through. And so the result of that has been just to squish all this innovation that's going on in universities, small companies, medium-sized companies, much of which is where the quantum industry is now. There's a lot of those entities that are very key part of the innovation circle, and those could get squished by a burdensome regulatory system put in place right now. I remember going and giving a talk at Oregon State University, and in the afternoon before my talk, I was meeting with some of the researchers, and one researcher actually burst down in tears and said, I've been working on this gluten-free wheat for 10 years, this genetically engineered gluten-free wheat, and now I've come to a complete dead end because I can't generate $100 million to get it approved. and everything I've worked for 10 years, and people want this product, I can't get it to the market because there's a $100 million regulatory wall in front of me, and it's just ruined my career, ruined all my work. And it was just very poignant about how regulation can just squish out really important innovations and products if it's not designed to allow other types of innovation to occur. So I think that's a real important lesson. The industry went to government and say, regulate us, and sure enough, they got regulated. It's worked out okay for Monsanto and Bayer and DuPont and Dow, these huge multinationals who can afford the $100 million, but even they can only afford the regulation for these large commodity crops. They can't do smaller things like, a drought-resistant cassava that would help so much with sub-Saharan Africa. Some of those companies were developing that. They had to stop it because they couldn't afford the regulatory costs.
Thank you. I think that's such an important story. And I will confess, certainly there are many government officials out there who were much better suited for understanding the economics than maybe I was when I was a federal attorney. But one of the biggest surprises to me when I left the government and I went into the private sector was how much of the economics really drives a lot of decision making. In fact, I would even say in quantum today, I'll talk about ion trapping. I think you may know that IonQ recently changed out their ion from ytterbium to barium. We at Quantinuum are also moving from ytterbium to barium. That is actually not based on the fact that barium is a better ion. In fact, it's not. Many researchers would suggest that ytterbium provides better results. However, the change is being made in part because it's so much harder to have the lasers that we need to actually ionize and perform operations on ytterbium than it is on barium. The cost is huge. And that's just one small example of decisions being made that's driving technology, right? That's a business decision. And that's something that we accept. This happens a lot in how you kind of manufacture and take things from the lab to the marketplace. However, if you maybe caught my talk a little bit earlier, I will mention export control. I think this is a great example for the quantum community as to where there could be some challenges. Now, as I've said, I think the regulations that have come into place are fairly straightforward and going to be fairly easy to implement relative to maybe some of the other regulations that we've seen or suggestions we've heard of. But that's still a big ask to small companies. For my company, we're roughly 500 people, and we do have a law department. We do have people who specialize in export control and who can help us with these various jurisdictional requirements as we move from place to place. Most small companies don't have that, and the actual economic cost is very prohibitive, as if you have maybe 20 people, right? You're trying to make payroll. You certainly can't afford a law firm to come in and tell you whether or not you can share this information. And so decisions often get made based on some of these regulations. And so for me, the biotech industry was an absolute fascinating study to consider. What happens when you have a framework come in too early before you actually have a realized risk? Now let me ask you this, because you've spent a lot of time on AI. I'd love your perspective on the governance in AI and what's happening right now.
So what we see with AI is following the same playbook we've seen with biotech, with cyber technologies, information communication technologies, with nanotech, and now AI, and I would predict also quantum, is we have a lot of proposals and ideas to create a specific new statute to govern this technology, to create a brand new agency to govern this technology. There's multiple proposals to do that for biotechnology, for nanotechnology, and now AI. None of those are going to get enacted. What we're doing instead in the United States, and Europe is different. Europe does adopt these big special statutes, but in the United States, we just parcel out the technology across existing agencies. And there's a lot of sense to that because, as someone in an earlier talk in this session said, the government isn't interested in a quantum solution to something. They're interested in a solution, period. And maybe it's quantum in AI, and maybe it's quantum in something else, or maybe it's not quantum. But the point is, they're more interested in the solution or the problem that is trying to be addressed. So I think what will happen, I would predict what's going to happen with quantum, as we're now realizing is happening with AI, is it's these existing agencies who have these areas of expertise now have to add quantum into their field scope of products. And so for medical products and medical uses of quantum, it'll end up being the FDA. For communications, it'll be the FCC. for banking and other types of financial services. There's a series of different agencies, including the FTC, who are regulating that with AI issues. And the same thing's going to happen with quantum. So I think the game plan or the roadmap for regulation is to look forward of where are the products and applications going to be that could create problems that the government might care about, and then what existing agencies do those come under? And almost certainly every problem will be under one of the existing agencies who have expertise on that problem, just no expertise on quantum. So the downside of that approach is all those agencies now have to gear up and person up to deal with the new technology. So they're all, dramatically trying to hire AI experts right now into the FDA and the FCC and the FTC. And that's hard for a government agency because they have very limited budgets. It's not like they can just go fire their, 30 or 40 people who have been doing traditional technologies and move them in a bunch of AI people. So it's a lot of retraining often of people who are pretty smart maybe, but have no specific expertise in that technology. That takes resources, that takes expertise. It's very hard for them to compete in the marketplace for experts in these cutting edge technologies. Certainly AI, everyone's getting $300,000 or more a year. Government doesn't pay that much. And so they can't attract the PhDs coming out of Stanford or Carnegie Mellon in AI. Those people are getting these huge, $300,000 or $400,000 jobs in Silicon Valley or elsewhere. So they can't attract the top talent that they really do need to be able to have informed regulation. So there are some limitations of this model we use in the United States of farming it out among the existing agencies. But I would predict and happy to bet with anyone that's exactly what will happen with quantum.
I actually like that approach, frankly. I think that makes sense, and here's why. Now, I'm talking in particular about quantum hardware. I think quantum sensing might be a little bit different. But for quantum hardware, a lot of the problems that I've heard as risks, there's actually a pre-existing framework. And so let's talk about, say, working on the human genome, right? Or chemistry sets and molecules. Some of the data that's coming in is very sensitive, right? And it may be anonymized and maybe it's not. But there's a pre-existing framework for the exchange, the treatment, how you hold this data, how you exchange this data, what the requirements are with this data. And so I think as we start to look at risk in the quantum community, it is just absolutely critical for folks to really identify what risks are we talking about. I think everybody in the quantum field is aware of the risk of shores. And nobody really knows when these systems will become cryptographically relevant. But you notice I said cryptographically relevant versus shores, because I think as you start to really dive into the technology behind what is cryptographically relevant, meaning that you can have a full-scale fault-tolerant system that may be able to break some forms of encryption that exist today, that may not equal the ability to break public key encryption while things are being transmitted over the internet. And so that creates a different framework for risk. If you talk to CIOs and CISOs, they'll often say, I'm not all that concerned about that end period. That is still a far place away. I have immediate concerns and risks. And what they're really saying is, I have a pre-existing framework, whether it's written down with my company or embedded in my head, that I am trying to identify and mitigate the practical risks at hand. And so one of the reasons you'll constantly see me, so apologies for those of you who are at Q2B or any other event, you're like, oh, there's Kaniah, that lawyer, always talking about law and trying to get us to understand. It's because I think this is such an important area. And I think that quantum is complex and it's hard to understand. And the risk that we face with it being so hard to understand is that it becomes easy for regulators and policymakers to hit an easy button and adopt some type of framework that others are putting forward. So being able, whether you're in a company or in the government or in academia, to be able to articulate and identify what is the risk, or help me identify what is that risk, and then look at what frameworks do we have? Because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the FDA does have a strong framework around management of data. So I do think that's an important position to take.
There are often new issues coming up and issues that the government sees coming that doesn't have yet the time to deal with it. And so one of the other lessons from AI is that soft law governance, as it's called, sometimes self-regulation, has played a critical role. Essentially, all of our AI regulation in the United States today consists of industry self-regulation, soft law mechanisms, whether they're best practices, codes of conduct, private standards, a variety of different mechanisms have been put forward, and those are what companies are using today. And those are really critical in the AI space. Even the new European AI Act incorporates soft law, industry standards, and best practices for the vast majority of AI products. So it's an absolutely critical part of the governance infrastructure is what are the companies and other think tanks and groups like that putting together standard setting organizations, certification bodies for these other non-governmental governance tools. And they play a critical role, and so a key question will be what will emerge in the quantum space. One of the lessons we've learned from AI is there's too many. So we just did a study of over 630 different soft law mechanisms in AI. If you're a company operating in the AI space, you look at 630 different programs out there that you're supposed to conform with. It's just impossible. You can maybe pick one or two. And how do you pick one or two out of these 630? So what happened is every company spawned their own best practices or code of conduct or standard, and then all kinds of other groups did as well, and everyone's just flooded into this space with their own ideas, which is great in some ways. It's innovation in the governance space, but now we're left with, that 630 was as of a year ago, it's now probably well over 800, maybe 900 different soft law mechanisms out there that are all competing. And maybe in the end, you know, it'll be a competitive process and some will win. But right now, it's just an absolute mess out there. The same thing happened with nanotech. There were so many different standards. Companies couldn't figure out where they should operate, which ones should they conform to. So I think a lesson from that, again, is soft law, these industry standards play a critical role in the governance of the technology, both to assure the government that, you know, they don't have to rush into their hard law regulations, to assure the public, to prevent any early misfortunes, which can have a devastating impact on the technology. Incredibly important to develop those soft law mechanisms, but you want to have sort of one or two. You want some kind of industry convergence on what that should be so that everybody knows what the relevant instruments are rather than this 800 competing proposals floating around out there that's just an absolute mess.
You know, first, I really appreciate you talking about soft law and its impact to industries. And before I mention my next thing, I just wanted to note that we are happy to take some questions from the audience if folks have questions or want to make a comment or want a little bit more of an explanation. But one of the things you mentioned was standards. Now, in the quantum community, we don't have standards, certainly not around. I suppose I should say we are starting to develop them. The export control regime at least came in and has set some basic standards for what they believe should be controlled. But by and large, there's not a coalescence around how to determine certain things. Now, I have heard, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I have heard that Europe tends to be a little bit more aggressive on creating international bodies to help create standards. And I have also heard from, I will say, certain government folks who shall remain unnamed, who may set standards, that they sometimes have a challenge in getting the US to participate in these international bodies. Can you think of any type of, or are you familiar with any similar situation where there's been standard setting bodies where maybe the US is not participating, or maybe countries like China are over participating and you're starting to see some challenges there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's three really different approaches to private standards in the world. There's a Chinese approach, which is basically the government controls the standard setting. And those standards are set to favor Chinese interests. Europe is a hybrid between the industry and the government working together on the European standards. So the European standard organizations all have a very heavy government hand. And then the US is much more the industry and academia. And so we have groups like, you know, ASTM and IEEE and so on. There's very little government involvement in that. So I'm chairing the sort of lead standard for IEEE on AI governance by any organization that's either developing or using AI. And we were asked to develop this standard in 2 years. It's now been 4.5 years. One of the problems with the IEEE, which I think is a great standard setting organization, is anybody can participate in this standard setting body. And as chair, I'm supposed to get consensus of these 100 different people who include like a philosophy grad student from Europe, someone from Google, DeepMind, just incredibly different levels of expertise and interests. We're supposed to come together with a consensus-based process. And we're getting there. We will be finished within the next 2 to 3 months, but it's taken 4.5 years to develop that standard, which is a long time. Whereas if you look at things like autonomous cars, where the people participating all tend to be industry only, those are cranking out those standards every year or year and a half, much faster. So again, these broad-based governance standards, which IEEE is talking about now for quantum, just like they are for neural tech and some other technologies, it's a real evolution for them from going from standards of basically how pieces of equipment fit together to now these governance standards, which are really quasi-regulatory, much broader than they traditionally put standards out for, are now having a major impact in the marketplace because they are international, they are recognized by a lot of companies. They can be extremely important, but who participates in developing them becomes very critical because the government on the US side is just hands off. NIST wanted to come to one of our meetings just to say, good luck, we're supposed to support you, let us know if we can help you at all. And a lot of the documents they produce, they claim are supposed to be things we can consider. The problem is when we use NIST documents, all the Europeans and Asians all object because that's too US-centric. But we've been working at that for 4.5 years, and the question is, do you want one of those on quantum as well? And if so, who's going to be at that table?
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for folks, certainly in the audience, and for companies to really start thinking about how we want to manage governance as an industry and what can we do. Quantum is so interesting because it's small and it's nascent and it's also very international. And so I think a lot of companies can play a very pivotal role in looking at what's happening in various ecosystems around the world and help to inform, whether it be IEEE or the government or any of the bodies that are starting to come up. But I am also hearing of several centers that are being created around ethics and quantum. And I really encourage industry to become involved and reach out to these organizations because it's important that industry's voice is heard along with others because industry is facing some of these issues near term and can provide some benefit and support. We have about 2 minutes left. Did you have anything else, or I can?
I just add, on that last point, we're also seeing now the proliferation of academic articles on governance of quantum by people who may know something about it, may not. A lot of those are very, I would say, radical, very intrusive, very heavy-handed, right at the very early research stage of regulation. I'm reading a couple of them right now. And it scares me that they're actually proposing this, but they will get published, they will get out there, and they then start to generate some interest from NGO groups, and that could just snowball. That's what happened with biotech, it happened with nanotech, it happened with AI. Just all these groups start becoming, anti-nano, anti-biotech, anti-AI, building off these academic articles. So we're seeing that exactly starting to happen now, and the question is, how can you try to have a more reasoned and logical debate than some of the proposals I've seen coming into academic articles lately.
Thank you. Yeah, my plea for everybody again, if you're in industry and in quantum, please, please, please talk, get out there and make sure folks understand what it is we need, because right now, for those who aren't going to Congress right away, quantum is still a very bipartisan issue. So whether you want to talk about funding or regulation or anything, you're finding China hawks along with very liberal Democrats and all of the folks in between who are very interested and see both the national security and the economic security. But it's so critical that we continue to have this voice and make sure people understand and kind of demystify some of the fears that come about with quantum and help provide a little bit of sanity so we don't have biotech and these over-regulations because people are afraid of monsters being created and running around. So thank you. Thank you so much, Gary.
Well, let me just say one more point if we don't have any questions. Just the last thing I'll say is, the nanotech industry was just absolutely paranoid that someone would make a movie of Crichton's book about nano dust. He put out this book, Prey, and they were just, if a movie got made about that, that would be the end of their industry. So What about quantum? There's already a movie out called Afraid. I don't know if you've seen this. It's mostly about AI, but it's also an AI run by quantum, they say, in the movie. And so quantum becomes this bad word in this movie that millions of people are going to see. And there might be more of those coming. So again, that's another area that will fan the flames of, drastic regulatory reactions.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. We got to keep our Ant-Mans because at least that's a friendly quantum reference. Some of these scary quantum references that sometimes drives changes in policy. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerry.